The day had started like any other for Daniel Grant. A crisp, sunny morning greeted him as he stepped out of his suburban home, coffee in hand. But the perfect facade belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Something had been wrong for weeks now, small, inexplicable incidents that were too strange to ignore. The lights in his home flickered every night at exactly 10:12 p.m., the faucet in the upstairs bathroom dripped blood-red water for a few seconds before running clear, and, just the night before, he had heard what sounded like whispers from the walls. Daniel wasn't a man prone to paranoia. As a freelance graphic designer with a penchant for late nights and caffeine, he had always brushed off the oddities as tricks of an overworked mind. But last night had changed everything. It had started with a simple sound, a faint creak from the attic. Lying in bed, Daniel had dismissed it as the house settling, but the sound had grown louder, more deliberate. Finally, a low, rhythmic tapping began, 3 knocks, followed by silence, then 3 more. The pattern was maddening, and before long, Daniel had crept up to the attic with a flashlight in hand. The attic had been as dusty and lifeless as he remembered, filled with forgotten boxes and the faint smell of mildew. But as he swept the beam of his flashlight across the room, something caught his eye, a small, crudely drawn symbol on the far wall. A triangle inside a circle, with what looked like scratch marks around it. The ink was dark, almost fresh. Daniel had stumbled back, heart pounding. "Who the hell," he muttered, but before he could finish the thought, the flashlight flickered and died. In the suffocating darkness, a single, chilling whisper reached his ears. "Leave." Daniel hadn't slept after that. He'd spent the remainder of the night on the couch, every creak and groan of the house amplified in his heightened state. When the sun rose, he almost laughed at himself. "I'm losing it," he muttered, shaking his head. But the symbol in the attic wasn't a hallucination. It was there, and it was real. He resolved to figure out what was happening in his house, starting with a quick internet search. The day dragged on as Daniel delved deeper into local history and urban legends, piecing together fragments of a chilling story. His house, he discovered, sat on the site of an old orphanage that had burned down in the 1940s. Dozens of children had perished in the blaze, their remains never recovered. Locals believed the land was cursed, and the symbol Daniel had found matched a known occult marking, a ward, some claimed, meant to seal something away. By late afternoon, Daniel felt the creeping weight of dread. His home, the place he'd considered his sanctuary, was tied to something dark and sinister. But he wasn't about to let fear dictate his life. If there was an explanation, he'd find it. That night, the tapping returned. This time, Daniel was ready. Armed with his flashlight and a baseball bat, he climbed back into the attic. The air was colder than it should have been, and his breath misted in the beam of the flashlight. The symbol on the wall had changed, new lines radiated from the circle, forming what looked like a jagged sun. "Who's up here?" Daniel demanded, his voice echoing. But the only response was silence. Then, the knocking began again, 3 sharp raps on the floorboards beneath his feet. Startled, Daniel crouched down, his flashlight trained on the wood. Slowly, he pried up a loose plank and found a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and aged, and the pages were filled with frantic handwriting and sketches of symbols, including the one on the wall. At the very back of the journal was a single, chilling sentence scrawled in red ink: "Do not break the seal." Daniel's pulse quickened. Seal? What seal? Was the symbol some sort of protection? As he stared at the words, the flashlight flickered again. He barely had time to react before the attic door slammed shut behind him. The next day, Daniel visited a local historian, an elderly woman named Eleanor who ran the town's library. He showed her a photo of the symbol, and her reaction was immediate. Her face paled, and her hands trembled. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my attic," Daniel replied. "What does it mean?" Eleanor hesitated before speaking. It's a containment sigil, she said finally. Used in rituals to trap spirits or entities. If it's on your property, it's because someone believed something dangerous was there, something that couldn't be allowed to roam free. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. And if it's broken? He asked. Eleanor's expression darkened. If it's broken, she said, you'll need help. By the time Daniel returned home, the weight of the situation was suffocating. He hadn't broken the symbol, but it had changed on its own. Did that mean whatever was trapped was getting stronger? That night, he decided to set up cameras around the house. If something was causing these events, he wanted proof. He placed one camera in the attic, another in the living room, and a third in the hallway outside his bedroom. For hours, he sat in the dark, watching the feeds on his laptop. The attic camera showed nothing but shadows, and the living room remained still. But just past midnight, the hallway camera picked up movement. Daniel leaned closer, his breath catching. At first, it was just a faint shadow, almost imperceptible. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew darker, more defined. A figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow, moved toward his bedroom door. Impossible, Daniel whispered, his heart pounding. He bolted upstairs, the bat in his hands, and threw open the door. The room was empty, save for the faint smell of smoke. He checked the footage again, his hands trembling. The figure had stopped just outside the door and disappeared. But in its place, something new had appeared, a single word scrawled in ash across the camera lens, run. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat on his couch, the laptop glowing faintly on the coffee table, replaying the footage over and over. The word scrawled in ash, run, was burned into his mind. His house was no longer just haunted. It was warning him, almost taunting him. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier, oppressive. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, as though the house itself was alive, watching him. Daniel knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. He decided to call Eleanor again. The historian answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert when she heard his panicked tone. Eleanor, I need help. The symbol, it's changing. And something's in my house. It left a message. There was a pause. A message, she asked, her voice cautious. Yes, Daniel said, swallowing hard. It said to run. Eleanor exhaled sharply. You need to leave the house, Daniel. Right now. Pack a bag, lock the doors, and go somewhere safe. Daniel hesitated. But if I leave, won't whatever's there just follow me? No, Eleanor said firmly. It's tied to the property. But if the seal is breaking, it's only a matter of time before. She stopped herself. Before what? Daniel pressed. You don't want to find out, she said. Get out, Daniel. Now. But Daniel didn't leave. Something held him back, a mix of stubbornness, curiosity, and a gnawing fear that running wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he decided to confront whatever was in the house. If the entity wanted him gone, it would have to make him leave. That evening, he set up more cameras, covering every corner of the house. He armed himself with a flashlight, his baseball bat, and a handful of salt he'd read online could ward off spirits. The house was eerily silent as he moved through the rooms, checking each camera feed on his phone. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Midnight came and went, the house remaining still. Daniel started to wonder if he'd imagined everything when, suddenly, the lights flickered, and his phone buzzed. The alert was from the attic camera. Heart pounding, Daniel pulled up the feed. At first, it was just static, the screen crackling with faint white noise. But then the image cleared, and he saw it, the figure. It stood in the center of the attic, its form unnaturally tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch unnervingly far. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were aware of the camera. Then, slowly, it turned to face the lens. Daniel's blood ran cold. The face, or lack thereof, was a void, a dark, featureless expanse where eyes and a mouth should have been. The figure raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera. The feed cut out. Daniel ran upstairs, his flashlight sweeping wildly across the attic. The symbol on the wall was glowing faintly now, the jagged sun pattern pulsing with an ominous red light. "Show yourself!" Daniel shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. "What do you want from me?" The attic fell silent, but the air grew colder. Daniel's breath misted in the flashlight beam as a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. "Leave." Daniel tightened his grip on the bat. "No. Not until I know what you are." The voice laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that reverberated through his chest. "I am what they feared," it said. "What they tried to contain." "The orphanage?" Daniel asked. "The fire, was that you?" The voice grew louder, more distorted. "Their fear fed me. Their screams gave me strength. And you," it hissed, "you have freed me." Daniel's stomach churned. He took a step back, nearly tripping over a box. "I didn't do anything," he shouted. "The seal, it broke on its own." The figure materialized then, stepping out of the shadows. Its elongated limbs moved unnaturally, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "You stayed," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You let me in." Daniel fled the attic, slamming the door shut behind him. He bolted downstairs, his mind racing. Eleanor's words echoed in his ears, "Get out. Lock the doors. Leave." But as he reached the front door, he froze. Standing in the foyer, illuminated by the flickering chandelier, was the figure. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, blocking his path. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. He clutched the bat, his knuckles white. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "To feed," it said simply. Before Daniel could react, the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. When he came to, Daniel was lying on the living room floor. The first thing he noticed was the silence, thick, oppressive, and absolute. The second was the pain, a sharp, throbbing ache in his head. He sat up slowly, his vision swimming. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong, charged, almost electric. The cameras were smashed, their shattered pieces strewn across the floor. Daniel stumbled to his feet, his mind foggy. The last thing he remembered was the figure lunging toward him, its long arms outstretched. Had it knocked him out? And if so, why was he still alive? He didn't have time to dwell on the question. From upstairs came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt leaden. He backed toward the front door, his eyes fixed on the staircase. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. The figure descended slowly, its movements almost mocking. As it reached the bottom step, Daniel noticed something new, a faint glow emanating from its chest, pulsing in time with the symbol on the attic wall. "You can't leave," it said, its voice reverberating through the room. "You are mine now." Daniel bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing on the sidewalk several blocks away. He fumbled for his phone, dialing Eleanor's number with shaking hands. When she answered, her voice was frantic. "Daniel? Are you okay?" I left," he panted. "I ran. But it's still there." Eleanor's silence was deafening. Finally, she spoke. "You need to destroy the seal completely," she said. "It's the only way to banish it." "How?" Daniel demanded. "How do I destroy something that's already broken?" You'll need fire, she said. And salt. Lots of it. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. If I go back, it'll kill me. Eleanor's voice softened. It won't kill you, Daniel. Not yet. It wants to feed on your fear first. That's how it grows stronger. Daniel's mind raced. He had no choice. If he wanted his life back, he had to face the entity head-on. The walk back to the house was agonizing. Daniel's every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find shelter in a motel or a friend's house, but he knew there was no escaping this. Whatever had been unleashed in the house wasn't bound to him, it was bound to the property. He had to end this nightmare before it could spread or grow stronger. The house loomed before him like a dark, menacing shadow against the night sky. All the lights were off, and the air was unnaturally still. Daniel clutched the supplies he'd gathered, a bag of rock salt from the garage, a bottle of lighter fluid, and a pack of matches. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stepped through the front door. Inside, the oppressive atmosphere was even worse. The air felt thick and heavy, almost alive. Daniel's flashlight cast long, trembling shadows across the walls as he crept toward the attic stairs. A noise stopped him dead in his tracks, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. The growl grew louder, morphing into a sinister laugh that echoed through the empty halls. You came back, the voice taunted. Brave. Or foolish. Daniel gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the bag of salt. I'm not afraid of you, he lied, his voice trembling. The entity's laughter filled the house, a sound so cold and cruel it sent shivers down Daniel's spine. Oh, but you are, it said. Your fear is delicious. The attic stairs creaked under Daniel's weight as he ascended, each step feeling like a step closer to his doom. The symbol on the wall was brighter now, pulsing with an angry red light that illuminated the entire attic. The entity was waiting for him. It stood in the center of the room, its tall, gaunt form silhouetted against the glowing sigil. The air around it seemed to ripple and distort, as though reality itself were bending in its presence. Daniel forced himself to move, scattering a thick line of salt across the floor in a wide circle around the symbol. The entity watched him with an almost amused tilt of its head, its void-like face unreadable. Do you think this will stop me? It asked, its voice low and menacing. No, Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. But it'll slow you down. He emptied the lighter fluid over the floorboards, soaking the wood and the sigil in the center. The entity's form flickered, its edges blurring like a glitch in a video feed. You don't understand, it said, its voice rising. Destroying the seal will only free me completely. You'll unleash me on the world. Daniel hesitated, his thumb hovering over the matchbox. Liar, he said finally. You're already free. That's why you're trying to scare me. The entity let out a guttural snarl and lunged toward him, its long arms outstretched. Daniel struck a match and threw it onto the lighter fluid. The flames roared to life, consuming the sigil in an instant. The entity screamed, a sound so loud and piercing that Daniel clapped his hands over his ears. The attic shook violently, the walls cracking as the fire spread. You fool, the entity roared, its form flickering wildly. You've doomed us all. Daniel stumbled out of the attic, the flames licking at his heels. He tripped on the last step and tumbled to the floor, his lungs burning from the thick smoke that now filled the house. Coughing and gasping for air, he crawled toward the front door. Behind him, the house groaned as though alive, its walls splintering and collapsing under the weight of the fire. The entity's voice echoed in his ears, growing fainter with each passing second. This isn't over, Daniel, it hissed. You can't escape me. With one final burst of strength, Daniel threw himself out the front door and onto the lawn. He lay there, coughing and trembling, as the flames consumed the house behind him. The fire department arrived minutes later, their sirens cutting through the night. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, their faces lit by the flickering glow of the inferno. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to move on. He rented a small apartment across town, far from the ruins of his old home. The house had been declared a total loss, and investigators had ruled the fire accidental, citing faulty wiring. But Daniel knew the truth. He kept Eleanor's number saved in his phone, though he hadn't called her since the night of the fire. What would he say? That he'd destroyed the sigil and survived, but that the entity's words still haunted him? That he still felt its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of his awareness? He tried to convince himself it was over. The entity was gone, trapped in the ashes of the house. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. One night, weeks after the fire, Daniel woke to a familiar sound, the rhythmic tapping he had first heard in the attic. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. His blood ran cold as he sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from the wall behind him. Slowly, he turned to look. The faint outline of a symbol was etched into the wall, glowing red in the darkness. And then, from the shadows, came a whisper. "Run." Daniel sat frozen, staring at the glowing outline on the wall. The same jagged sun symbol from the attic was now etched into his new apartment. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he strained to listen, but the room was eerily quiet. The whisper that had told him to run seemed to hang in the air, its presence palpable. He grabbed his phone, fumbling to dial Eleanor. The line rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "Daniel," she said, her tone laced with concern. "It's not over," Daniel blurted, his voice trembling. "The symbol, it's here. It's in my apartment." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "I was afraid of this," Eleanor said finally. "What do you mean?" Daniel demanded. "That entity," she explained, "it's stronger than most. Fire would weaken it, but it wouldn't destroy it entirely. It must have latched onto you when you destroyed the seal." Daniel's stomach dropped. "You're telling me it's following me now?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "It's feeding on your fear, using it to grow stronger. If you want to be free of it, you'll need to confront it directly." "How?" Daniel asked. "I already burned the sigil. What else is there?" Eleanor hesitated. "There's a ritual," she said at last. "A banishment. But it's dangerous, and it requires a blood offering. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Daniel clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the phone. "I don't have a choice." The following evening, Eleanor arrived at Daniel's apartment, carrying a leather satchel filled with supplies. Candles, herbs, and a long, curved dagger were among the items she laid out on his coffee table. "The ritual must be done in the place where the entity's influence is strongest," Eleanor said, lighting a circle of candles on the floor. "Where did you first see the symbol?" "The attic," Daniel replied. Eleanor nodded. "Then that's where we'll start." She handed him the dagger, its blade cold and sharp against his palm. "When the time comes," she said, "you'll need to draw blood, your own. It's the only way to seal the ritual." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding. He followed Eleanor as she began to chant in a low, rhythmic voice, sprinkling salt and herbs around the perimeter of the room. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost electric energy. As they worked, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally across the walls. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and the candles flickered violently. "It's here," Eleanor whispered, her voice steady despite the rising tension. The entity appeared in the corner of the room, its tall, gaunt form materializing from the shadows. Its void-like face was turned toward them, its long arms twitching with unnatural movements. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed, its voice reverberating through the apartment. "You are nothing." Daniel gripped the dagger tightly, his knuckles white. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. You're going back to where you came from. The entity let out a bone-chilling laugh, its form flickering like static. You're too weak, it taunted. Your fear feeds me. Eleanor began to chant louder, her voice rising in pitch as she held up a small vial of red liquid. The entity recoiled slightly, its form wavering. Now, Daniel! Eleanor shouted. The blood offering. Daniel raised the dagger, hesitating for only a moment before pressing the blade against his palm. The pain was sharp and immediate as blood welled up, dripping onto the floor. The entity let out a deafening scream, its form twisting and contorting violently. Eleanor continued chanting, her voice unwavering as the circle of candles flared brightly. The apartment shook, the walls cracking as the entity thrashed against the invisible barriers created by the ritual. You cannot contain me, it roared, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair. Daniel stepped forward, his blood-soaked hand extended toward the entity. You're not welcome here, he shouted. Go back to where you came from. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness. The candles flared one final time before extinguishing, plunging the room into silence. When the lights returned, the apartment was still. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Eleanor knelt beside him, her face pale but relieved. It's done, she said softly. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with both gratitude and exhaustion. Is it gone? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. For now. But these things are never truly destroyed. They linger, waiting for the right moment to return. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to rebuild his life. The apartment no longer felt tainted, and the nightmares that had plagued him began to fade. But the memory of the entity's void-like face and its chilling whispers lingered in the back of his mind. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a faint tapping sound coming from the wall. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the blank wall, waiting. But no other sound followed. Not this time, Daniel whispered to himself, gripping the dagger he now kept under his pillow. And though the silence stretched long into the night, Daniel knew one thing for certain: the battle might be over, but the war was far from won.